Welcome to our webinar on how the U.S. can better compete globally on R&D. I'm Michael Mandel, Chief Economist and Vice President of the Progressive Policy Institute. This webinar is presented by PPI's Innovation Frontier Project, www.innovationfrontier.org. To achieve our short-term and long-term progressive goals, we need to focus policy on accelerating scientific advancement and technological improvements. The Innovation Frontier Project commissions research to bring new ideas and public and policy proposals to these debates. Between the pandemic, supply chain snarls, and increased economic competition with China, there is growing recognition of the important role that R&D plays in solving today's pressing issues and building tomorrow's economy. To address these concerns, the Senate passed the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act in 2021, and the House recently passed the America Competes Act, which deals with the same issues. Both bills include provisions to beef up semiconductor manufacturing in the U.S., initiatives for STEM education and workforce development, and measures to increase the resilience of supply chains. The House and the Senate are now working to come up with a compromise version that can find broad support. That won't be an easy effort. However, the backdrop is a sense that the U.S. is in danger of falling behind in key emerging technologies. President Biden acknowledged the importance of these concerns and the importance of R&D in his State of the Union address, calling for legislative action. In addition, the Biden administration recently released some reports on deep problems in key supply chains that make for very scary reading. Today, we're bringing together three experts who have recently published relevant papers for the Innovation Frontier Project: Ashish Arora, Sharon Belenzon, and Keith Belton. Ashish is the Rex D. Adams Professor of Business Administration at the Duke Fuqua School of Business. He receives his PhD in economics from Stanford University in 1992 and was on the faculty at the Heinz School at Carnegie Mellon University, where he held the H. John Heinz Professorship until 2009. Ashish recently produced research under the IFP banner for American Innovation Under Threat, Restrictive Legislation, and Global Competition. Sharon, who also was co-author on that research, is a professor in the strategy area at the Fuqua School of Business of Duke University and a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. His research investigates the role of business in advancing science and has been featured in top academic journals such as Management Science, Strategic Management Journal, and American Economic Review. Sharon, with his co-author Larissa Chioka, recently wrote a paper called Government Procurement, a Policy Lever to Revitalize Corporate Scientific Research. Keith is Senior Director of Policy Analysis with the American Chemistry Council. His research and writings explore the intersection of public policy and private markets with a particular focus on economic development, regulation, and competitiveness. And his paper was Building a Stronger, more Complex U.S. Manufacturing Sector. If people have questions or comments, please put them in the Q&A box, which we'll be monitoring. Ashish, why don't you start?
Good morning. American technical leadership is under challenge. Next slide, please. And what I'm going to argue is we need a new social compact to revitalize corporate research. Next slide, please. So the argument is pretty straightforward. American science and technology leadership is being challenged. And a key component of maintaining American leadership and economic prosperity is the role that established corporations play, the technology leaders, and in particular, the role they play through their investments in upstream research in science. As I will show you, a number of companies in America have begun to withdraw from scientific research, from upstream research over the last 2 or 3 decades. And it's vital that this trend be reversed. And for this, I think what we need, part of the solution is a new social compact between the leaders in society that supports such investments in research. Next slide, please. If you go back to the period after World War II, the so-called golden age of American capitalism, this was a time when the established corporations played an immense role in leading America to technological and scientific leadership. The established companies not only produced path-breaking inventions and path-breaking new technologies, but this was supported, this was the outcome of the tremendous investments they made in upstream scientific research. And this research paid off also in terms of the large number of, there are as many as 14 Nobel laureates that worked for companies, not universities. And if you think about what these companies produced, DuPont produced path-breaking innovations in polymers, plastics, synthetic fibers. Bell Labs produced the semiconductors. Kodak produced digital photography. One could go on, but the point was this was the time when companies were investing in large-scale research. Some of the benefits they appropriated, but some redounded to the broader national benefit as well. Next slide, please. Since 1980s, companies have begun to withdraw from the upstream part of research of R&D, the R of R&D. And you can see this both in individual cases and in more systematic data that Sharon Belenzon and I have put together with our collaborators. Next slide, please. In two specific cases I'll present here, which represent important fundamental national priorities, we can see this pattern playing out. If you look at AI and ML, artificial intelligence and machine learning, if you focus on the left graphic, the round one, you will see 3 American firms that are among the leading producers of scientific research in AI ML, and the rest are universities. This investment in science is reflected in the position of these companies in technology as well. So if you look at the middle graph, you can see Google, Microsoft, and IBM prominently among the top patenting organizations after adjusting for quality. And finally, this pattern is also reflected in the marketplace, where we've all seen the products that have come out as a result of advances in artificial intelligence and machine learning. However, we cannot be complacent. Rivals are rapidly gaining ground, and it's important that these investments be sustained. And as I'm trying to argue to you, this is not just about universities. It very importantly involves the corporations themselves. Next slide, please. Here, this is the case of 5G telecommunications, and you see a different picture. You see in the left graphic, American companies are no longer the leading producers of scientific research in 5G. This is then reflected in technology, which is the middle graphic, which represents the technical contributions to 5G standards by the top 15 companies. And you can see American companies, which are just the ones without shading, are no longer, are not the prominent ones. The leading ones are also the ones that are producing the science: Huawei, Nokia, and Ericsson. And if you then look at what happens in the marketplace, you see a similar picture. It's not the American companies that dominate the global telecom equipment revenue market. So the point of what I'm trying to show with these examples is corporate research is important, and it's not just corporate invention or corporate technology development, but also corporate investments in upstream research. Next slide, please. Now, some might argue that since the 1980s, the American innovation system has changed, and we have, American universities, which are truly the world leading ones, and they're producing the new science, and this is being commercialized by startups. However, this would be a mistake, because while it is true that Silicon Valley and startups are a tremendous resource and a great source of invention, this new innovation ecosystem that we have is unbalanced. And we need the established corporations to provide the third leg of the stool. So just to give you an example, if you think about the Google Translate project, which we now all use on the web, if you think about what it took to put it together, it required not just machine learning, it required linguists, statisticians, software engineers to deal with all the massive data, but importantly, also hardware engineers to design and produce the new chips, the tensor processing units that the Google Translate project required. And this is the fundamental point, that corporate research is different from university research. It's different from what startups do. Corporate research is large scale, it's mission oriented, multidisciplinary, and of broad scope. And this cannot easily be replicated by other components of the US innovation ecosystem. Next slide, please. And so this is what I'll conclude. If we need corporations to continue to invest in upstream research, it's often the case that the benefits will not accrue, or in fact, the primary benefits will typically not accrue to the corporation that's making the investment. Much of it will accrue to the US economy much more broadly. Therefore, on the one hand, we need these companies to commit to these kinds of long-term investments, keeping in mind not just their private narrow interest, but also the broader national interest. And in return, I think policymakers have to provide some type of support and forbearance for these companies so that they can make these kinds of long-term investments in the national interest. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ashish. That was really interesting. I've got some questions, okay, but we'll come back to those after everybody's made their presentation. Sharon, why don't you go next? You're muted.
Oops, sorry. Okay, start again. You're giving me my 1 minute back. All right, so Michael, now you are.
Now you can have your 1 minute back.
All right, so thank you so much, Michael, for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to talk about this really exciting topic. I'm going to build on Ashish's presentation. I'm going to focus on one component in the American innovation ecosystem, specifically the government, and how the role of the government in driving corporate R&D has changed. This is based on my work with my PhD student, Larissa Chiyooka. And if you are interested, a much more detailed summary of the research is available on the website. So the government affects R&D, corporate R&D, in two main mechanisms. The first one, I think most of us know, is direct funding of research and development. It can be by providing money to universities, to national labs, or even directly to corporations pursuing specific research agendas. This is kind of quite well understood. The second channel which we focus on is something that we don't know much about, and I'm going to argue that it's extremely important to essentially focus on it, which is the government also provides demand for products that results from corporate R&D. The government is a major kind of consumer of products, and the kind of products and the kind of technological problems the government kind of seeks to pursue will definitely affect the kind of research companies do in very significant ways, and I'm going to talk more about that in the next few minutes. The third leg, which I'm not going to say anything about, by which the government influences innovation, is clearly legislations and regulation, but this is not for the next. This is not something I'm going to touch on in the next 5 minutes. Next slide, please. So this is like the key argument that we make, and hopefully I can kind of clearly explain. I think it's quite simple. When choosing which technology problems to solve by specifying procurement requirements, the government essentially pursues dual objectives. The first objective is to secure technological superiority over rival nations, something that maybe today we pay more attention to given the events that are happening in East Europe. And the second is to promote social and economic development. While these two objectives are related, they are not the same. Achieving technological leadership is critical for national defense, but may not lead to economic benefits and competitiveness in global markets. At the same time, a higher level of economic development may not produce the advanced technology that we need for national defense and geopolitical influence. The key argument that I like to make is that how much weight the government puts on each goal changes over time, mostly in response to shifting geopolitical realities. For example, like maybe the classical best example for the first shift in kind of national priorities is the 1957 Sputnik shock. This is like started the space race between the US and the Soviet Union, when the Soviets successfully launched the world's first artificial satellite. At that point in time, the US government essentially adopted an extreme quality approach for seeking technological solutions that had nothing to do with immediate commercial applications, for example, putting a man on the moon. At this point, the government said, we need to harness the private sector to help us solve problems that the market currently does not care about. In order to incentivize and convince companies to work on these extreme quality products, where the only thing that matter is quality, regardless of cost and regardless of how you can profit from it in the short term, the government started to reward companies by providing them exclusive contracts, guaranteed demand for the resulting products coming from their research and development. This has changed when the Soviet Union collapsed. And at that point, once the Soviet Union collapsed, the emergence of the so-called peace dividend led the government to put much more weight on economic considerations when they decide which problems to support or which products to buy from companies. At that point, the government started to emphasize much more cost, competition, and dual-use technologies when choosing which kind of products to acquire. Clearly, the point I'm trying to make is that as a primary objective of the government changes, moving away from emphasizing kind of national priorities and extreme quality projects like putting a man on the moon, towards developing economic, or essentially emphasizing more economic development problems, as those objectives shift, the private sector is also going to respond by changing the type of innovation that it does. In this respect, the argument that we are making here is that procurement policy is effectively innovation policy. And next slide, please. This just to show you how big this problem is. We kind of focus on, if you go back to the first slide I discussed, the kind of two different legs or three legs. The first leg, which is direct support from the government to research, R&D by corporations, is essentially negligible if you think about how much, if you look at the volume of procurements and also the R&D contracts that companies essentially pursue before gaining access to lucrative downstream markets. So the point to make here is that it's really important, in our opinion, to really think hard about how government demand affects corporate innovation. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to just kind of summarize, show you three different patterns of how things change over time. I'll do it very briefly, and clearly I can go more deeply in the Q&A if there is interest. It's based on our work with Larissa, so it's based on the data that we collected ourselves. The first thing I will show you is that if you look over time at government procurements, the first thing that you see is a reduction in the share of R&D contracts awarded by the government. Now, these R&D contracts are R&D contracts that are essentially tied to a specific downstream procurement later on. What we see an increase, a sharp increase in the share of commercial contracts. These are typically contracts for products and technologies that already exist and already have market applications today. Next slide, please. This is something which is worthwhile maybe talking for like 30 seconds on. One of the key mechanisms by which the government was able to convince companies to work on what we call extreme quality projects, to work on projects and invest their own money in technologies and research that does not have any immediate application. They cannot commercialize it in the product market because there's no demand for it. The way the government used to reward companies was to essentially offer them guaranteed demand. If companies were able to demonstrate technological superiority, they were able to show with an R&D contract that they can solve a problem better than someone else, the government will come in and say, you are going to get this really lucrative contract and there's going to be no competition. You are going to get it for sure as a reward for essentially being successful at the R&D stage. This has changed. This has changed gradually from starting in the 80s and really changing faster after the collapse of the Soviet Union due to many different changes that happened. But mostly as the government shifted its priorities from emphasizing extreme quality projects into emphasizing more economic considerations, as this happened, the government also started to emphasize much more competition, cost, fairness, and transparency in how it awards contracts for corporations. Which means if in the past, the role of the government was to essentially replace private markets in trying to convince companies to work on problems that currently did not have any immediate applications, but had applications in the future, this role of the government has shifted drastically over the past 20 or 30 years, as the government also moved to emphasize technologies that already have applications and moving away from this mechanism of guaranteed demand. Next slide, please. Perhaps one way to illustrate the consequence or potential, another kind of element in what has changed is if you look at the type of the contracts that the government awarded for different types of companies based on whether they have scientific capabilities or not. What this graph shows you is that while over time, the amount of funding from the government has not changed, when you look at companies that actually engage in science, we saw a tremendous entry of companies gaining contracts, but essentially those companies have no scientific capabilities at all. They do not participate in the creation of scientific knowledge. In other words, over time, the government has also prioritized or de-emphasized, if you like, the importance of scientific capabilities when essentially awarding R&D contracts and procurement contracts for corporations. If we can go to the next slide, and this is my concluding slide. This is what I'd like you to kind of get from my talk. So the first point, which I think is important, government procurement policy is effectively innovation policy. By choosing the problems the government seeks to solve, the government also shapes how much upstream R&D, essentially scientific research, corporations do. And if we link that to Ashish's presentation, the decline in scientific capabilities of firms, I don't want to say was caused by the government, but clearly the government did not help in essentially preventing that trend, or essentially slowing down that trend. Second point I'll make is that we can actually use what we've done in the past, and we can revitalize global research by going back to policies that the government has used in the past, by rewarding non-competitive guaranteed public demand for companies that are able to demonstrate strong scientific capabilities. We have done that. It was a major success. I think now the government is likely to kind of put a higher weight on the first objective of technological superiority, given the geopolitical tension that we see. So I think it would be a good idea to look back at what was successful in the past and adopting, or essentially maybe modifying a bit procurement policy to be aligned with the question of how do you incentivize companies to devote their essentially resources to work on problems that are important for advancing quality and knowledge, but may not have immediate applications in the marketplace. And the last point I think is obvious. So let me stop here. I think I took a bit more time than I wanted. So Thank
No,
you.
that was terrific. Combined with Ashish's presentation, this really lays out a coherent framework for thinking about U.S. corporate R&D policy. And I've got several questions, but we'll come back to those. Keith, it's your turn at bat.
Well, thank you. I think we can start with that first slide. So there you go. I want to start with an observation, and that is, despite political divisions, U.S. elected officials have in recent years expressed bipartisan concern about the loss of U.S. manufacturing capabilities, and they're willing to do something about it, especially if the capabilities relate to making advanced technology or R&D intensive products. Now, these policymakers intuitively understand something called economic complexity theory, which says that nations grow faster and become wealthier if they expand the frontier of their collective know-how. Now, I recently wrote a paper for PPI where I used international trade data to look at the frontier of know-how across nations. So it turns out that in the 21st century, the United States is not doing very well, but other nations like China are. And this provides an opportunity for US policymakers. Next slide, please. So this chart looks at the export basket of a few selected countries by decile of complexity. Now, I should first explain that all traded goods can be ranked in terms of complexity, and nations can be ranked in terms of the complexity of their export baskets. So in 2018, South Korea and Germany were near the top in terms of their complexity ranking. The US was 12th, and Thailand was 22nd. Now, this chart suggests that this ranking is driven largely by goods in the highest decile of complexity. The takeaway here is that the US resembles Thailand more than it does Germany or South Korea, and this is worrisome. So even more worrisome is the fact that the US has seen its comparative advantage in the highest decile of complexity fall from more than 60% in 2000 to just over 40% today. In other words, its frontier of know-how is contracting. Now, you might ask, how does this compare to China? I think the next slide shows the China story. So as it turns out, China has transformed its export basket in the 21st century. Its comparative advantage in the most complex traded goods has risen from just over 10% to well over 50%. Now, the US is still ranked higher than China in terms of complexity overall, but China is catching up, and if current trends continue, within the 10 years, China should surpass the United States. So what can the US do in this kind of situation? Well, the answer is it can expand its frontier of know-how. And this is the big idea from complexity theory. And frankly, even though complexity theory is relatively new, this idea has been understood for centuries. Our founding fathers understood it. Alexander Hamilton wrote about it. Abraham Lincoln promoted it. And given his State of the Union address on Tuesday night, Joe Biden is pushing for it. So the next slide provides a more in-depth explanation or illustration of how to apply complexity theory. So I've asked a question here, onshoring US electronics, where to start. So for decades, global supply chains for electronics have migrated away from North America to Asia. Of the 51 categories of electronics that are globally traded, according to the 4-digit harmonized system codes, the US has a comparative advantage in just 8. This chart shows 18 categories of electronics where the US does not have a comparative advantage, but are related to the 8 categories where the US has a comparative advantage. The size of each bubble reflects world trade in that particular product category. Now, ideally, the way I've composed this chart, it would be great to see a bunch of big fat bubbles in the northeast corner, but that's not the case. The best opportunities on where to onshore US electronics really lie in the labeled products that are shown in the chart. And when I look at this chart, I see opportunity especially for integrated circuits, which are also known as computer chips. So this is one of the reasons why I like the House-passed Competes Act and the Senate-passed USICA. Both aim to build US capabilities in computer chips, especially the most advanced computer chips. The US does not have capability to make the most advanced computer chips. That capability lies in Taiwan. There are also other provisions in the bills that comport with complexity theory. If I can have the last slide. So going through the two bills, I see the following provisions that are listed here as consistent with this big idea that nations should expand their frontier of know-how. I would note that R&D is a critical ingredient, and there is a significant boost to R&D in two of these provisions, the new NSF Directorate and the Manufacturing USA program. And I think with that, I'll stop and conclude my remarks.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Keith. That was super helpful. So I remind the people in the audience that that they can ask questions through the Q&A chat box. If you're listening by a live stream, as many of you are, you should go to the Zoom and ask questions that way. So let me start with you, Ashish. You talked about a new social contract, and you talked about forbearance, and I think that's just a really interesting idea here. The sense is that we need corporations to be making long-term investments in research, even if perhaps they do not sort of see the immediate economic value of this. Okay, talk a little bit more about the social contract that you see as important here.
Sure. Let me just back up by saying doing research inside a for-profit corporation is a difficult activity to manage. There's now some scholarship on this, and it's clear that companies have struggled with how best to handle this function. And more recently, I think that there's increasing pressure for financial performance from the shareholders to hold managers accountable. And the difficulties of managing this, the difficulty of showing how these investments are creating benefits for shareholders, have led many companies to withdraw from this activity, to rely on externally produced inventions. So the idea is we don't have to do this ourselves. There are lots of really smart people in the world. We'll just buy this. We'll license it, or we'll acquire the startups, or what have you, or we make alliances. And that works in some cases. Okay. But in other cases, for certain types of important inventions, in new materials, so think about new semiconducting materials, it's very difficult to imagine that this is going to come out of a university lab or even a startup, just because of the complexity and the diversity of the sets of skills needed, and the long time horizons and the large amounts of capital that we needed to make it work. This is where corporate research, this is the sweet spot for corporate research, because they can bring together both the science and the technology and the marketing and the market and domain knowledge, and figure out what the best way to bring something forward is. Often it'll take a long time, and it requires patience, and it requires sustained investments.
And let me just step in here. And you're talking about really large corporate research at this point, rather than startups. So when you think about the ecosystem, you're thinking about an ecosystem that includes startups as one leg of the stool, large corporations as one leg of the stool, and academic as one leg.
That's exactly right. So I think we've moved to a system where it was mostly large corporations like IBM or DuPont or Bell Labs or GE making these investments, to now, American universities have grown in size and sophistication, and there's now a vibrant startup market. The argument is there is still a very important third leg of the stool, which is the investments by large corporations. Now, this is the point, which is many corporations find it difficult to justify these investments and how to manage it. And I think what we need as a society is to support when companies and leaders of these companies want to make these kinds of investments. And Sharon's presentation provided a really important dimension of this kind of support, which is we could start providing procurement contracts, for example, for companies that are building this kind of capability. But that's just an example of what I mean by support and forbearance. You might think of this as regulatory forbearance as well. So, for example, there are now a number of initiatives floating around to curb the market power of large corporations. And I'm not an expert on antitrust, so I don't want to say whether those are well intentioned or not. But I will say this: not all corporations that are large and have market power should be treated the same. Companies that are investing in the long-term national interest should be shown greater deference and forbearance. This would be another example of what I mean by how policymakers can support these sorts of investments.
That's really very interesting. Sharon, you mentioned that you had built a data set of producers and non-producers of science. Okay, does this is this a snapshot, or does it sort of pick up shifts from one category to another? That is to say, are companies that are producers of science, do they stay producers of science, or have we seen some companies abandoning their production of science over time?
Yeah, so this is great. Thank you for this question. So at Fuqua, we have been I think for more than a decade, working on trying to collect systematic data that will help us identify the type of R&D activities companies pursue, from upstream research, scientific research, trying to understand nature and advance the frontier of science, into the the development of ideas, development of science into potentially useful applications and products. So we've done it in different ways. These are all measures, noisy measures, but they all point in essentially one clear direction, which is over time, most companies in the US have decreased the share of R in corporate R&D. And you can essentially see that by looking at how many publications companies publish in top scientific journals, like DuPont, as we write in different chapters and papers. DuPont used to publish more papers in the first half of the 20th century, more papers in journals than MIT and Caltech and other departments combined. And this clearly has changed. In 2016, for instance, DuPont's lab was completely dismantled. So I think no matter where you look, if you look at history, if you look at specific case studies, you look at systematic data, looking at scientific publications, patent data, and even looking at individual inventors and scientists that we are trying to look more closely at. The picture is, in most cases, corporations are withdrawing from research. There is a handful of companies which are not, and Ashish touched on those companies. Very few companies are not withdrawing from research and are actually holding the fortress in terms of corporate science. And I think those companies, should be singled out, and at least consideration should be given for their contribution to a public good, which all of us benefit from, which is advancing science. And let me just reiterate one thing, which Ashish essentially said several times. We believe, and I believe, that the kind of research that those corporations continue to perform cannot be substituted or replicated in any other part of the American innovation ecosystem, which, as Ashish mentioned, has changed drastically over the past 40 years.
So how would you characterize the types of research, the types of that are being underrepresented these days because of corporations withdrawing from upstream research? This is
this question for me or for Ashish?
Both of you. You go first, and then Ashish.
So I think, okay, let me just Ashish actually has a very nice paper that looks at exactly this question, the missing middle. And he can talk about this, but essentially, we just in one sentence, if you look back at American excellence, where American research was top-notch, leading the world, essentially chemistry, physics, material sciences, I would say that we have lost those capabilities mostly to a large extent, at least on the big corporation side. And we didn't lose these capabilities, I think, as much in other sectors like ICT and biotech and essentially life sciences. But in the middle, like she showed you this picture about the Nobel Prizes, the Nobel laureates, mostly coming from corporate labs, the Bell Labs of the kind of mid 20th century. If you look carefully at those Nobel Prizes, they were mostly in chemistry, physics, material sciences, etc. I think those capabilities is what we lost, and maybe it's not surprising that this coincide with also losing, to a large extent, big corporate science. Ashish, do you want to add to it?
Yeah, I agree. If you think about new materials, clean tech, I mentioned next generation semiconducting materials. I think those are examples where in a different kind of ecosystem where corporate research was vibrant, we might have seen a lot more progress on that front.
I think this is very interesting. Keith, how does this fit into complexity theory? I mean, it sort of sounds almost like the flip side of the same story.
Well, I mean, I would make one observation, and that is that there's the government, this Manufacturing USA program is about collaborative research. It's government, academia, and industry pooling resources for pre-commercial technology that wouldn't be funded if left to the private sector alone, because it's too far away from being commercialized. And so we have about 15 Manufacturing USA institutes in this country. Each is devoted to a subject that affects a wide range of manufacturers. So catalysis, for example, or machine learning, artificial intelligence, industry 4.0. Government contributes a certain amount of money. If industry contributes at least that much, and usually it's 2-to-1 match, the industry to government money. And academics are also brought in. In fact, it's usually headquartered near an academic institution with specialty in that area of expertise. And the idea being that you're bringing products that can be widely useful to market faster by leveraging government funding to inspire corporate funding to be spent where it otherwise wouldn't.
I need to ask you whether these projects have been successful so far.
Well, it's fairly, I think it's still early. Certainly the companies that are involved in the Manufacturing USA Institutes see a lot of value, but that value is from the researchers interacting with other researchers and intellectually being stimulated to make progress. As to specific products that are coming out of it yet, I think it's just starting to happen, given the first few institutes were really came to be during the Obama administration. And so we'll learn more in the next few years.
That's a good point. So in terms of the US losing ground in complexity, okay, would you say that this is a reflection of choices that companies have made on the research side, or that government has made on the procurement side? I mean, to what extent are we seeing the working out of on the trade data of research choices and procurement choices that are being made by other players?
Well, I think one of the big factors, frankly, over the last, my time period of interest was the 21st century. And I think one of the big factors is globalization trend, and China joining the WTO in 2001. And there are a lot of multinational corporations in this country that shifted production toward Asia, but also more recently have shifted research and R&D toward Asia. I think maybe the high point of globalization has already passed, and we've seen some pushback against that in recent years. And I think companies and I think even the supply chain challenges that we have since the pandemic started in 2019 are a reflection that maybe we've gone too far on globalization, and we need to be more careful about what we offshore and what we do at home. And I think companies are also being a little more regional in their supply chains focus these days. And I hope that translates into R&D, and I hope that translates into product design. And I think we'll just have to look at the data and see.
And then I'll ask this question to all three of you. Do you think we should be concerned where research is being done, whether it's done in the US or done in Asia, or say done in Russia or the Ukraine? I mean, to just name two countries. Okay, should we be, maybe if you look at the supply chain documents, reports that the Biden administration put out a couple of weeks ago, they were really, pretty scary, some of them, in terms of where things are made, but should we be caring about where things are researched as well? Sharon?
Let me just say one thing, which is kind of maybe a bit, not a direct response to your question, but I don't want to emphasize it. Building on Ashish, the job of corporations is not to do research. Like I work at a university, my job is to do research. I get paid to do research. Corporations get paid to make money. And it's really important, and we live in the US, that corporations have access to the kind of most efficient capital markets in the world. First of all, big firms don't really need money. And if they do need money, they don't need to go to the government. They can go to the capital markets to find problems and to find products which are essentially potentially profitable. So thinking about the government as a bank, just a financing agency that is it works when you think about like universities, etc. But I think if you kind of, based on our research, big firms actually lose money when they get R&D contracts from the government, because they're viewing the R&D contract as an investment into big, lucrative downstream kind of projects or contracts. So I think really thinking about the government as a demand mechanism and not just providing funding to businesses would be a major transition, in my opinion, in how we can make our ecosystem work better. And does it matter? And does it affect like how you organize research in the US or not? I think at the end of the day, it boils down to who gets the kind of manufacturing contracts, which what drives research decision by firms. And maybe I'll stop here and kind of let others respond.
And the other point that, just to sort of finish up this, the other point that you made in your paper and also in your presentation was the role of guaranteed contracts, okay, which can actually provide a floor for companies and enable them to do certain things that they couldn't do otherwise. This certainly shows up in the PPE market all the time, okay, which is the companies complain that yes, when you in order for them to sort of maintain the assembly lines for PPE, they need to know that they're going to get contracts along the way. So yeah. I think thinking about guaranteed demand, which is hard to think about, is important. Ashish, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I mean, think about the tremendous success story that life sciences has been. So the COVID response is a wonderful example of guaranteed demand, the COVID vaccine response. But more generally, one reason why private investment has been very happy to fund long-term research in life sciences is because the demand, in a sense, is guaranteed. If you can show technical superiority, the current pharmaceutical system is set up to not provide guaranteed demand, but essentially something like where demand and revenues will be far more predictable, right? And that's when you can do that, then you can draw in this vast pool of capital that we've got in America. There's no shortage of capital for sure, but private investors have been happy to fund speculative, large-scale, long-term investments because they can understand better what will happen once they show technical superiority. Once the drug shows efficacy and safety, there is a very clear pathway laid out as to how you get into the market. The FDA and then the government backed Medicare and Medicaid type schemes that pay for these things, along with then private insurers that follow suit. So this is just to point out that the role of government in backstopping demand is very important in an industry where we typically don't think of it.
So let's actually sort of wind this up at this point. If you could tell policymakers in 2 or 3 sentences what they should focus on, what would you tell them? Keith, why don't you go first?
I would say expand the frontier of know-how for the United States. And so that involves not just R&D, but where we make things and how we make things. And so I would say USICA and the Competes Act are a good start, and the provisions I mentioned. And I would also suggest revisiting them every few years. You know, we have a farm bill that's revisited every 5 years. We have a defense authorization bill that seems to be revisited every year or every Congress. Why not have a factory bill or a manufacturing bill where we really focus on innovation so that the U.S. can make more things here?
That sounds great. Sharon, what would you tell policymakers?
Yeah, I think the government, you know, one of the dream of the government to some extent is to harness the business sector to work on problems that the government cares about. The government has tried to do this on an ongoing basis with big tech. It's really hard to convince companies like Alphabet and others to essentially move away from the huge demand they face and now essentially address the problems that the government wants them to address. It's really hard, and we've seen that essentially, if anything, the government demand shifted into dual-use technologies. Essentially, the government changed the kind of problems it wanted to be aligned with the kind of problems that Google and other companies are working on. At the same time, there is a huge, in my opinion, pool of resources, scientific resources that are still located at the hands of what we call like traditional big companies that still are very sophisticated technically, but they potentially do not have the same market incentives or market constraints, if you like, as big tech. I would actually try to essentially tweak and modify existing reward systems that the government applies or essentially can deploy in order to try to harness and speak to this huge pool of potential talent that is not, I would say, doesn't command the same huge market share as big tech. I would like to see much more of that kind of conversation and not just how can I convince Amazon and Google to innovate for me as the government. I think this, for me, it would be interesting and refreshing to see. Does it make sense, Michael?
Absolutely. Ashish, okay, you get the last word here.
Sure. I'll just repeat. The American innovation system is strong and vibrant, but it has some important gaps. Some established corporations with their sophisticated science and technology capabilities are a vital part of this innovation system, and they need to be encouraged and supported.
Thank you very much. Thank you to our three panelists today, Ashish, Sharon, and Keith. For the people who are listening, this event will be posted on the IFP website, innovationfrontier.org. Please follow us as we continue delving deeply into this topic about the importance of research and development for U.S. competitiveness and U.S. strategic power in the world. Thank you very much.